Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 127th video in our Master Series and the first video in our Mastering phase. After we get done with this phase, we are going to do a package and distribution phase, so hold on for that. But we may address some of that while we go through this phase. This is kind of an introduction to the mastering phase so that we can address a couple issues. The first thing is that to tell you is that normally what mastering is taking a mix down of whatever production that you're working on and making it sound as good as it can in some certain format. So that, say, MP3, for instance, that you prepare the file so that it sounds as good as it possibly can when it's formatted into any certain format. So that's a real simple concept, is that when you format something like, say, from a WAV file that you have that's at 64 bits, that's at 96 kilohertz, that it goes into a MP3 format, that you're going to have some things happening to the audio that need to be taken into consideration and adjusted before you format so that it comes out as close to the mixed down file as possible. And it's a very simple concept. So with that in mind, that historically that some mastering engineers will do it differently. So you might get some mastering engineers that will prepare the file differently because of what the quote unquote, reggae, how it's being mastered, or pop, how it's being mastered for MP3s at this point in production, that you kind of want to copy what they're doing there. But most of the time that you just want to make it sound as close to the mix down as possible, because those people mix that stuff because they really like the way they mix and they get done with the mix. So, you adjusting that, then they might not want you to do that. So the other thing is that sometimes the mastering engineer's job is to sweeten the mix. Now, if you watched the last phase when we were going through processing, that I tried to reiterate that most of your work is done in the mixing, and when you're processing, you're just trying to sweeten the mix. So you are basically taking the role of a master engineer when you do that. Unless you're going to leave that to the mastering engineer, which can cause problems, because unless he has the whole song file to adjust, that all he can do is adjust a master wave file that you've sent him, which he's not going to be able to do it probably justice the way he thinks by sweetening it, unless he goes back and adjusts things like we talked about when we were processing. So you really have to keep that in mind. So we will go on the assumption that you are going to be a master engineer. Now, one thing is that if you're sending the product to somebody, that you may want to send them the whole song file. Take the whole folder that you did of the complete project, copy that whole file, and then rename the song file as master's copy or something like that, so that if he wants to go back and adjust anything in the song, the individual tracks, their buses, the processing that you did, that he can adjust it there rather than just adjusting a mix down that you got done with, and he'll be able to do a much better job. But he's probably going to charge you more for that, so keep that in mind. He's expecting you send him a finished mix that he may make some just suggestions to you or the producer about maybe adjusting something a little bit that he sees as not quite right for how things are supposed to be getting put out onto the radio nowadays for that certain type of genre or that certain type of production, and he can make suggestions. But most of the time he's not going to rework your mix because he thinks that something should happen without asking somebody, unless he's just doing a little bit of sweetening, like he's just going to boost the bass end up a little bit or do just a little teeny bit of sweetening like we talked about when we were doing processing in the last phase. So really keep that in mind. Some of the biggest things that he's going to be dealing with, some fine points, is that, loss of data compensation. Whenever you're formatting and you're putting into different codecs or containers and things like that, that you're dealing with compensating for round off error, overflow, underflow, quantization error, sample loss, bit loss, reinterpolations as it's formatting. dealing with the formatting algorithm, the codec and container, and any errors that might be producing, because sometimes it's cutting out information that you have. The concept is you have, this color palette that has 36 colors that you've made this mix from, and when he formats it, that the format's only using 20 colors or 15 or 16 colors to represent that original file from the mix. And so he has to try to work with those and make those sound as good as possible to represent the original file, as well as he can with what the codec and the format and the container leaves behind after formatting. So which means he has to do the work before formatting. So basically he's going to format it, and then he's going to compare it to the original mix down, and then he's going to go, okay, what's different? What got cut out? What doesn't sound good? Then he's going to go back into the mastering suite and make adjustments to things that take that into consideration. Then he's going to reformat it and then compare, and then he's going to go back and make adjustments and reformat it again until he get those two, the original mix down and this formatted file for distribution, as close as possible to what the original mix sounded like. So that's a real simple concept. You can read this if you want, and it can be a lot of study. When you're dealing with being an audio engineer or a mastering engineer, normally a mastering engineer hopefully understands audio engineering a lot better than the average guy. Does that make sense? So, he's supposed to be a master audio engineer. So he's expected to understand things, to make calls on things, to call you back, to call the producer back when he hears things that ain't correct, or problems or issues, and or be able to make good judgments with what he's got, so that whatever he does is good enough, and had somebody who is a professional master engineer look at, work on, and send it to the producer, the band, and the label, that it's ready to go on the radio. Does that make sense? And he's rechecked everything just in case anybody in line has missed anything, that he's sit down, he's got good equipment, good monitors, good headphones, and he's really got an environment to really critique what you're doing, to make any calls that as a master audio engineer on what might need to be fixed. And if not, to be able to do a little sweetening and to get it ready for formatting and format it so that you have a distribution package of different types of formats that are radio ready. So that may sound really simple, and it really is, but the things that you may need to take into consideration are why that I really, once you get going, that sometimes, that music's fun, but if you're getting to the point to where you're going to be a top-notch professional, that you're really going to want to do some studying of audio engineering and acoustics, the science of sound, so that you can really understand what's happening. A lot of these concepts, sound is very complex, and when you get into DSP and what's happening in certain situations to do certain things, of what it's doing with mathematics to change how things are coming out, that to understand that is going to make you a much better audio engineer, because it's not just your ears hearing a difference. You understand something is happening from understanding acoustics, the science of sound, and being a master audio engineer, to go, well, something is happening. I got a pretty good idea of what that is from my knowledge base and experience. So experience is another thing, that falls into place. So it's not all just making judgments, calls on what you're listening to. Sometimes that it's very difficult to hear. You hear something happening, but pinpointing what that is to make adjustments on it, if you have no idea what's happening, that you may not make, judgments that are good judgment calls, because you're not sure what's happening, and you're shooting in the dark to try to master things. Does that make sense? Or, whatever you're doing. That's why I tried to cover most of the most important parts when we were going through this master series, and I'm going to do the same thing when we go into mastering. But for the most part, this is normally my algorithm, and you can stop the video and take a look at this, my workflow of going through this. But for the most part, that, while I'm doing this, that it really is, for the most part, going through things and really, making these calls, checking it, reevaluating it, redoing it, checking it, redoing it, checking it, redoing it, until I come out with something that's, I would say is radio ready. Now, depending on what level you are as an engineer, that my humble opinion that is, if you do a mix down, that I should be able to stick that wave file onto radio. If you are not at that point, then you want to be real careful when you're sweetening your stuff and go light on things, to give that mastering engineer some headroom to make judgment calls to get your stuff ready for the radio, because he's got some experience of doing what he's doing, and he's got some experience with those genres, or he should, if the producer has picked the correct engineer, or the band is picked the correct engineer, to really make your stuff radio ready. So don't assume that you are that engineer. Let the mastering engineer be that engineer and take some of those appropriate steps like I talked about, so that he can be that mastering engineer to come out with that final product that you're hoping for. As you get better, and you evaluate what he's done, and you have some experience experimenting with that, and you even go ahead and try to make a master of your stuff, and then send it to a mastering engineer, and then compare it. What did he do? What sounds different between when I mastered it and he mastered it, to try to get to the point to where you can master yourself. And sometimes mastering engineers will talk to you about it. So I really, what's it going to cost for you to tell me exactly what you did, so that, because I'm pretty good at this, and, I'm just, I'm sending this to Sony or my label, bro, and what did you do that made that ready? Some will be more willing than others to go through that with you, or they might charge you for it, but that's okay if you're planning on doing it yourself. Does that make sense? But if you did a really good job of everything up to this point, that your stuff should just about be radio ready until you get to the point to where you are a mastering engineer and you learn to do this stuff really well, which is, basically the next step to getting it stuck on the radio and having it being radio ready, which is debatable. It really is a matter of you making good judgments calls, a matter of you evaluating things that are on the radio in the area that you're trying to produce in, and being able to produce things that are coming out as close to that as possible, or as comparable as possible, so that your stuff doesn't get pushed off to the side as garbage. Does that make sense? And I've seen some things come out that I go, that was a really good production. But if I stick it right next to Whitney Houston's thing that they did, that your stuff's going to get sloughed off. I think that your stuff is preserving dynamic quality and doing things that are really cool, but that's not what they're doing right now. And so you're not going to get the job because you did it a little bit differently. And actually, your stuff is probably, if I put an audio file in the room and listen to both those productions, that they would listen to your stuff before they listen to that song that Whitney Houston produced, because basically your stuff is better, but it's not comparable to what's getting radio play. So really keep that in mind, because that's a huge thing that sometimes people kick themselves in the butt because they're going round and round, and their stuff isn't comparable to what they're trying to do. Now, if it's just artistic and you don't care, and that's like, no, because that does sound better, that's the way I like it, and if they don't like it, well, does that make sense? Because and that's okay, as long as you can get to a point to where you are being that, rather than just not having an idea what you're doing and not making good judgments called because you don't have enough knowledge, and you don't have enough experience, and you don't have good enough taste. I hate to say that you don't have good enough taste, but sometimes I have some people, and it's like, well, I don't know, that doesn't sound too bad, but I don't know, does that make sense? And I hate to say anything because I don't want to stomp on nobody's boat, bro, because, music is a wonderful thing, to express yourself. And same thing sometimes with audio engineers are really a part of the artistic content, that you don't really want to stomp on them, but you also don't want to pat them on the back for something that, you think, I don't know, bro, does that make sense? You get caught in the middle there. So basically, when we go through this, that the concept is pretty simple of what we're trying to do, and if you can get that through your head when we start the mastering process, that it'll be a lot easier for you to get up to speed and get rolling to get some good products put out. So peace up, love. I hope you enjoyed this first video and the intro to the Master series, and I'll see you in the next video when we get to some detail.